Hey, Alex, good to see you, man. How you doing?
Hey, man, it's good to see you.
I am super excited because, as we've been doing our Dirt Nap City journey, there are certain people on the list that I think I'm kind of surprised neither of us have covered yet. And today's person that I have is one of those type people. Now, are there people on your list that, are like just the obviously should do's?
Yeah, I have some. Honestly, there's some that are so obvious that I don't do them.
Oh,
But
oh,
yeah, yeah.
I like that.
But I keep those in case of emergency.
Right.
Break glass kind of.
break glass and do this one. Well, today's for me is somebody that I had thought of for a long time, and I finally got up the courage to start doing some investigating. And I'll tell you, it is a little bit intimidating when you do somebody that has such great stature. It's somebody that is so well renowned that you think you're going to not be able to cover it all. And I'm sure I won't cover every aspect of this person's life, but I can tell you that there's a lot more to this guy than I think most people realize, including myself.
The first person you ever did was Andre the Giant.
Oh, yes.
The first person I ever did was Colonel Sanders. But the first guess you ever made was Jesus.
Right. I was guessing big. I was swinging for the fences.
The clue was you see him everywhere.
That's right. He's on signs and he's holding his hands out like this. And
right, exactly.
There's a bucket of chicken in front of him. That was the part that really gave
without
it away.
the bolo tie, they're indistinguishable.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, this guy might have rocked a bolo tie at one point. I don't know about that. He was sort of a fashion setter. He was born in 1706 in what at the time was British America, the colonies, right?
Ooh, that's 18th century.
Yep. And early 18th century, he considered the letters C, J, Q, W, X, and Y to be redundant and came up with a new alphabet. And he actually came up with sounds to replace those letters because he thought those letters, they were covered elsewhere, but there's certain, what are they called? Consonant blends that we don't have a letter for. He came up with new letters to replace the consonant blends.
So like C is, those sounds are like in K and S. You don't
Correct.
need that. Throw it out.
Yep. Get rid of it. And so it never caught on, but it was sort of one of his little experiments that he tried. He was always kind of trying stuff. He was said to have a keen sense of humor. In fact, despite, or maybe because he was a well-established person and thought very highly of, he wrote an article called A Letter to the Royal Academy about farting.
Are we talking about Benjamin Franklin?
Yes. It's so funny because I actually didn't even know about this fart proudly letter.
I didn't know that either. I think that the alphabet thing sounded like the kind of thing that a guy like him would do. I know he was all about efficiency, and trying to find inefficiencies. Then you have like a tax on window shades or something, or propose a tax on window
Yeah, that's
shades.
right. That's why there's only so many windows in actually on windows themselves. So a lot of buildings had fake windows or didn't have windows on a side where you couldn't see. Up in New England, that was kind of
because he wanted people to wake up and start the day.
Yeah. No, he was a go-getter. He also is said to be something that we're all about when you talk about him in the plural, the Benjamins.
Oh, yeah.
So we're all about the Benjamins.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, he did coin that letter when he was the ambassador to France, and he wrote the letter in 1781, and he actually, he didn't take himself too seriously. I think he was a very humble guy, and he actually said that letter was superior to his other scientific investigations, which were scarcely worth a farthing. Now,
I see what he did there.
Yeah, farthing.
It's a pun.
Yeah, it was a pun because farthing was a coin at the time, a unit of payment. Well, he did have some lesser accomplishments. First of all, he was a polymath. Now, I didn't know what a polymath was until I looked at this, but it's kind of somebody who's good at a lot of stuff, right? Is that your understanding of it?
Mm-hmm. Particularly languages, right?
Yeah. But I think science as well and arts. He was a writer. He wrote a lot of stuff. He was a printer, of course, and the printing press gave him the platform upon which to write things and become sort of famous for writing. Scientist, inventor, statesman, diplomat, publisher, philosopher. And he also carried 3 sets of letters behind his name. Now, Alex, I think you have letters behind your name, right?
PhD.
Yeah. So what does that stand for, actually?
Doctor of Philosophy.
So D is the doctor part.
Mm-hmm.
Philosophy, and what's the H part? Or is it just PH, like philosophy?
Yeah, the H is lowercase.
See, now Ben Franklin would have replaced that with an F and made a letter symbol for the PH part.
Right. And it would be DF, Doctor of Philosophy.
DOF. You're a DOF.
Yeah.
Like we were calling, when we went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, we were calling it the Rarhof.
Yeah, they do call it that. RRHOF.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, in addition to his flatulence essays, he had the FRS, the FRSA, and the FRSE letters behind his name.
And that's got nothing to do with flatulence.
Yeah, even though the F is prominent. F actually stands for fellow. So he was a fellow in the Royal Society, which FRS, and that was a society of arts that was based in London. And it was really something that, very few people had that. It was like being knighted, I guess, to have the FRS, to be a fellow in that. He was the fellow in the Royal Society of Encouragement for the Arts, which sounds redundant, but FRSA. And then FRSE was the fellowship of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which was the Scottish equivalent to all of that.
So this must have become before the American Revolution.
Yeah, it was still considered, 1706, when he was born, it was still considered the British colonies. He kind of started his career as a publisher, as you know, and I didn't realize this until I started going through here. The town of Scranton, Pennsylvania, there's a bar/restaurant that the fine workers of Dunder Mifflin go to called, do you know?
Called
Poor Richard's.
Poor Richard's.
Yeah. So did you know that has to do with Ben Franklin?
Poor Richard's Almanac. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Poor Richard's Almanac was something that Ben Franklin wrote under the pseudonym Richard Saunders, and he was able to write criticisms of the British people, and the British government and the crown under that name, and so that kind of kept him sort of anonymous. He did that a lot. He used a lot of pen names.
I remember the episode where they had the
Dundies?
No, the Benjamin Franklin impersonator come, and they thought he was the stripper. You remember that
one? No.
That's a good one.
I don't think I've seen that one. I do remember the Dundies, but that actually took place at a Chili's, I think, or an Outback Steakhouse or something like that. He just did all kinds of stuff. He was the president of Pennsylvania back when Pennsylvania had a president from 1785 to 1788, later in life. He was a scientist, studied electricity, and a lot of people considered him to be the first American. And when they talk about that, they talk about the first person to really want to unite the colonies together, to defend the colonies as a whole, not just each individual colony separately. And he became somebody that was influential in inventing the sort of society that America was destined to have. And so, they called him the first American.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, like many of the people from back then, he was born to very religious parents. His father was named Josiah, and his father was a tallow chandler. You familiar with what a tallow chandler does?
A tallow chandler? Well, tallow has something to do with beef, right? That's beef fat.
Tallow was used to make soap and candles. And so it was animal fat, and it was usually from the waste products of sheep or cows or whatever. And they prepared it by chopping it into small pieces and then boiling it. And then they would take the boiled stuff and they would press it, and out of that would come this, fat, the tallow, and that was what they used to make candles and used to make soap and things like that. You remember in Fight Club, they went to steal the soap or steal the fat from the weight loss place.
So the Chandler is the person that melts it down and chops it up and does all that?
Yeah, I think the Chandler is the one that basically wrestles with the dead animals to get they do the dirty work.
Oh, wow.
You think of soap and candles as smelling good?
Yeah.
Well, they don't.
Well, I don't think soap's made that way anymore.
Probably not. But it actually was a pretty difficult thing to get candles that would burn cleanly. But I guess Benjamin Franklin's father, Josiah, was able to do that. Now, Josiah had 17 children over the course of his life. I mean, can you imagine that?
Yeah, that sounds like it was probably not as much. It was probably not that much of an outlier back then, but that's still probably on the high end.
Yeah, I'm going to say even for the 1700s, 17 children is a lot.
Even if the average was 8, that's still double the average, right?
Josiah was married twice, once to a woman named Anne Child, and he married her in England, and they moved to Boston in 1683, and he had 3 children in England and then 4 more after. So 7 children under the wife Anne Child. And then after Anne died, he remarried somebody named Abiah Folger in 1689. And here with Abiah, he had 10 more children. And Ben was the 8th of those 10 children.
Good Lord.
Yeah. So, keeping all that straight. So I suppose Benjamin had a lot of cousins.
Yeah, and there's a degree of raising yourself or being raised by your siblings. When you have
yeah. As a matter of fact, interestingly, Josiah and Abiah wanted Benjamin to become something in the church. They wanted him to become clergy or something like that, but they couldn't really afford to send him to school. So, speaking of being raised by his siblings, he ended up getting a job with his brother, James, in the printing business. So that was kind of the first thing he learned when he was 12. He became a printing apprentice. And that was sort of his career path. And the nice thing about the printing job was it was a technical job, right? It was something that was skilled. You had to know how to do it. But it also gave an outlet, right? It gave an outlet for his ideas that he could write about. He felt that communication between the colonies and within the colonies was very, very important. And of course, there was, always the underlying current of separationists versus the royalist at the time. And so
this was newspapers, pamphlets, books, all of it.
Yeah. Primarily newspapers. As a matter of fact, when he was only 15, his brother founded the New England Courant, which was the 3rd newspaper to be founded in Boston in the early 1700s. So Benjamin was a gifted writer and wanted very badly to write for his brother's paper, but his brother wouldn't let him. He saw a conflict of interest and was like, no, I don't want to hear your crazy ideas. Don't write it. So he came up with another pseudonym, kind of like poor Richard, and it was Silence Dogood, a middle-aged widow.
And so his brother didn't know who that was?
Yeah. So he wrote
letters in.
He wrote letters to the paper under the name Silence Dogood, and he wrote them kind of about liberty and about freedom, and these things got pretty popular, and so popular that his brother actually got sent to jail for publishing them.
Wow.
Yeah, they were pretty controversial because the crown didn't like them. They saw these things being written about liberty and freedom. As a matter of fact, one of the quotes from Silence Dogood was, "Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech." And this got his brother into trouble, eventually getting him into trouble. So at 17, he got out of Boston and moved to Philadelphia and decided...
Did he ever fess up that was him?
Yeah. I think his brother found out. That might have been part of why he had to move.
Behind bars.
Yeah, his brother got locked up for 3 weeks in 1722. Anyway, Benjamin ends up moving to Philadelphia and gets a job at a printing house and somehow catches the attention of Sir William Keith, who was the mayor of Philadelphia, or governor of Philadelphia, I guess, at the time, or president. I don't know. I guess you can't really be governor of a city, but it was all different back then. Anyway, William Keith, who was a British royal, convinced Benjamin Franklin that he should go to England in order to investigate the latest in printing press technology, and he could bring stuff back to the colonies. Well, it turned out that while he was over there, he didn't get a lot of support from William Keith. Like, he didn't get money, that sort of thing. And he didn't end up staying for very long. But he did kind of learn a little bit more about the world, right? You know, travel at those days was not as common. It was a big deal for someone to go to London.
I was going to say, it always amazes me when we talk about these famous people and when they're going back and forth between Europe and just how long, it takes like 3 months.
Yeah, riding on a boat.
Yeah, and they got so much accomplished and still went back and forth. Pretty amazing. Have you ever been to Philadelphia?
I have.
There are Ben Franklins everywhere.
Yeah.
There are Ben Franklin impersonators, kind of like Elvis impersonators in Vegas.
Yeah.
There's, you go to Philly, you're going to run into a Ben Franklin impersonator on the street or in a mall or wherever. You're going to run into one.
So one of my favorite places in Philadelphia, we were there. We actually flew to Germany in 2019, and Philadelphia was we flew from here to Philadelphia and then from Philadelphia to Germany because that was the best rate. And we ended up spending 2 days there. Have you ever been to the Reading Market?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's like a food hall.
Yes.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite highlights of Philadelphia was the Reading Market. So
yeah.
Shout out to the Reading Market.
Yeah.
Well, after going to London and it not really working out the way he'd hoped, he came back to Philadelphia and he formed the Junto. Now, have you heard of this? This sounded familiar to me, but I hadn't heard of it. The Junto was a group, like a discussion group.
No.
It was apparently one of the first discussion groups in Philadelphia, in 1727. Yeah, like a book club. It was a group of like-minded and aspiring artisans and tradesmen who hoped to improve themselves while improving their communities. They were very high-minded back then.
Like a podcast does today.
Yeah, exactly. They would get together and kind of riff on people that had died before them from the 1600s and the 1500s and scribe it all down. And then Ben Franklin would print it. It was the weekly printed podcast called The Junto. No, it was, but what's interesting about it, first of all, it was modeled after English coffee houses. And apparently that's what they did in English coffee houses during the 1700s, was go and have these discussion groups. And it became the foundation for a whole bunch of other organizations in Philadelphia. Like basically a lot of them, a lot of the founders of other organizations were members of the Junto. And one of the biggest things they did was create one of the first libraries because they were all avid readers. And so books at the time were expensive and difficult to come by. So the Junto formed something that eventually led to the first public library in 1731.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But in 1728, he set up a printing house and became the publisher of the Philadelphia Gazette. Now, the Gazette was one of two competing newspapers in Philadelphia at the time. The other one was called the Mercury, and he published essays again. And I really love the tone of his essays. He had one called "The Busybody," and it was just sort of making fun of classist people. Like that was the whole gist of it. He started to get respect. People started to know his name, but he always signed his letters in his if he wrote under his own name, he wrote it as B. Franklin, printer. That was his signature.
Okay.
Not Benjamin Franklin, inventor, or rich guy or whatever. He was B. Franklin, printer. He even started a German language newspaper in Philadelphia called Die Philadelphische Zeitung.
Were there a lot of German immigrants there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there were German, English, Scottish. There were some Italians. But the thing that was interesting about Franklin with all these business ventures is he honestly saw the printing press as a device to guide a blooming country, a burgeoning country, morally. Like he really wanted a way for everybody to kind of be on the same page about virtue and what they should do and how their freedom should be, how they should be free and yet not overstepping and hurting other people.
So like an influencer of sorts. He was trying to put a stamp on what he wanted this country to be.
I think he was trying to influence the U.S. in a positive way, morally, freedom-wise. And it's interesting because he wasn't super religious himself. As a matter of fact, he wasn't religious at all, despite having grown up. But he had a very good moral compass. And his goal, after kind of having some success with the Gazette, was to eventually have a series of newspapers across the colonies. And by the time, by 1753, there were 15 English language newspapers around the colonies, and 8 of them were influenced by him, either owned by him or one of his partner organizations. So he had a lot. He was sort of the Murdoch of the time, or who's the big guy from CNN? Ted Turner.
Ted Turner, yeah,
yeah.
So he must have been making money during this time too, right?
Oh yeah. No, he was actually getting pretty wealthy by late 1730s, early 1740s, the time when all these newspapers started coming out. But what was also interesting, though, was that desire for him to create this series of newspapers across the colonies. It sort of started to fracture as they got closer to the Revolutionary War, because I think we like to think of it as everybody in the colonies was united and ready to split with England, but that wasn't really the case. There were lots of loyalists, lots and lots of loyalists, people that didn't want to rock the boat, people that, whose lives were already good. And then of course there were, British people just here temporarily. So it was definitely a very politically divided time.
Sure. Yeah. That probably was pretty scary to think about, cutting ties with Britain, doing it all on your own. Yeah, for sure.
Do you remember that? You remember that Schoolhouse Rock, No More Kings?
Yeah.
It was a great one. There's a cover of that Schoolhouse Rock by Pavement that I really love.
Yeah, I think you played that for me before. Yeah, it's a good one.
Musically, it's really nice. But so this was kind of getting into the time right before the war. But stepping back a little bit about his earlier life, he was a Freemason. And he became the Grand Master of the Freemasons in Philadelphia in 1734. Now, I was never quite sure what a Freemason was, but from what I understand, it's like a fraternal organization that is generally set up for good, but they do things in secret. Is that your understanding of it?
Yeah. Men.
Okay. Men, yeah. Men being men, helping other men. He was actually a Freemason for his entire life, and he also never officially wed or married, like in the traditional sense, but he had a common law marriage to a woman named Deborah Reed. Now, interestingly, he had actually proposed to Deborah Reed when he was 17 years old, and she was only 15, and he was living at her home as a boarder. I guess at the time, that was common to live in someone else's home. And he was in the U.S. or in the colonies, and then he proposed to Deborah. But when he did, he was also on his way to go to London to do the first time that the governor, Sir Keith, had asked him to go over there. And his Deborah's mother said, "No, you can't marry my daughter." Deborah ended up getting married to a guy by the name of Rogers while Benjamin Franklin was gone. But Rogers actually skipped town with the dowry, and he had some debts and things going on, so he had to get out of town. He ended up going to Barbados with her dowry, leaving her behind, and he was never heard from again. But because of bigamy laws, Deborah could never remarry. And so when Ben Franklin came back, he actually had to get a common law marriage with her in 1730.
So Rogers was kind of a cad.
Yeah, Rogers married Deborah Reed, who I think was already in love with Ben Franklin because Ben had proposed to her before that, and Rogers ended up skipping town with her dowry and left her in a state where she was considered married still, because Rogers was never declared dead or anything like that.
Well, maybe he ran into your pirate friends in Barbados. And
right.
Untimely death.
That would have been a good around the time, right?
But wasn't Ben Franklin kind of a player too?
Well, he did have an illegitimate son, or I know you don't like that word, a son out of wedlock. And so, yes, he had had one child before, which indicates he had been with some other women ahead of Deborah Reed. But interestingly, Deborah Reed did agree to adopt his son from another mother, and they also had Deborah and Benjamin had 2 children together. So they had Francis Folger Franklin. He was their son, but he died of smallpox. And then they had a daughter named Sally Franklin, and she lived. She went on to live. Now, William Franklin was the son that he had with a different mother. Interestingly about him, he actually was acknowledged as being born out of wedlock by Ben Franklin. He ended up living with Ben Franklin and Deborah Reed. He was educated in Philadelphia. He started studying law in London in the 1760s. He also fathered a son out of wedlock, William Temple Franklin, and that son happened to have been born on the very same day and month, of course, years later, as his father, William Franklin. And the thing that was really interesting about William Franklin was he was a loyalist, a big-time loyalist. He really despised the idea of cutting ties with England, and it kind of caused a little bit of rift between Benjamin and his son, William Franklin, because his son was a loyalist.
I would have thought the older people would have been the loyalists and the younger people would have been the revolutionaries.
Yeah. You would think. I mean, it's kind of unpredictable what younger people and older people will do politically. I think we observe that a lot today, right? You can assume things, but
yeah, I guess Brexit was all the older people. So I don't know what that's equivalent to, staying or
yeah. I thought Brexit was leaving.
It was. So I guess, is that the same as a revolution though? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it was breaking, but I think it was also, I think Brexit had to do with the fact that the older people didn't like people from Europe having free access to come into England, right? All these people that didn't talk like them or didn't look like them coming into England. That's my understanding. But it was the sort of irony that his son would end up being a loyalist while he was very much a revolutionist. He wasn't actually a revolutionist in the beginning, though. He was sort of a, what is it called? A compromiser. He was willing to walk the line in between because he had lived in London. He had a lot of British friends. He had been somebody that had really been in both societies. But when everything settled down, William Franklin ended up, after the Revolutionary War, he ended up moving to New York City because, or maybe this was during the Revolutionary War, he moved to New York City because New York City was a stronghold of the British. The British army was there. And then when New York City kind of ousted the Brits, the British troops evacuated, William Franklin left with them and sailed to England and never returned to the U.S. Benjamin Franklin insisted that the loyalists who had borne arms against the United States would be excluded from execution. And he was probably thinking of his son when he said that.
Yeah.
Let's say you were like a Detroit Tigers fan, and
I am.
And your son was a Chicago Cubs fan. Is that kind of what it would be like?
No, he's an Astros fan, but yeah, it's a little bit.
But you're an Astros fan too, right?
Yeah, sure. But yeah, you're right. Sometimes when they play each other, the gloves come off a little bit.
It gets a little rough. Yeah.
Yeah, it gets a little rough.
While all this was going on, leading up to the Revolutionary War, he had printed a lot of other people's works, but then some of his own. And one of his famous letters that he wrote that was published in one of his newspapers was Advice to a Friend on Choosing a Mistress. And that was from 1745. And it was about channeling your sexual urges. Okay. Now, and it was so lascivious. It was so raunchy at the time that it was very controversial that it was published. If you were going to give advice to a friend on choosing a mistress, what advice would you offer?
So, did mistress mean the same thing back then?
Yes,
it was like an extramarital affair.
You know what? Maybe it just had to do with someone you were seeing. That you were because it was supposed to be about kind of like
choosing a girl. Doesn't have to be
yourself.
like a cheating situation, but it's just
so give us some advice, Alex.
Oh man, well, when I was in the game, that was a long time ago. When I was in the game,
yeah, it was like 1751.
I would look for certain key phrases that would disqualify them. So like if a girl said something about, I hate my parents or I hate my family or something like that, that was a deal breaker for me.
Yeah.
Right. That's an example I remember well because I couldn't be with anyone who didn't think family was important. Right.
Yeah.
Now in a mistress situation, I would just probably advise somebody to go with somebody who's pretty low key and not very visible and
lives in England.
Yeah, right.
Lives in London.
That I don't know what advice I'd have.
Well, the first advice was good about the family thing. I like that.
Yeah, I think I'd look for certain things that would disqualify them. Okay, and then someone that you couldn't stop thinking about and want to be with all the time, probably.
No, only part of the time.
Well, on that, it depends on what
the type,
means.
Right? Yeah, I guess one of them would be all the time. But then if you decided to have another mistress, then it should be part. I think part of the time is probably better.
Someone you don't want to be with all the time,
right?
Then it would be completely different advice. It would be someone that you only want to be with some of the time,
right? You really enjoy it for short periods of time.
And probably, would you think it'd be better for someone to know your wife or not know your wife? By the way, if our wives are listening to this, this is just all hypothetical stuff.
It's all conjecture. Let's move on to another thing that Mr. Franklin did.
Can I get answer my question?
Mr. Franklin was one of the first people to come up with political cartoons. You know those little cartoons that aren't really funny, but sort of have a little political. My grandmother actually drew political cartoons.
Really? Like Doonesbury type of stuff, huh?
Hers were all one frame. It was just like a single thing. And I remember one that she actually gave me her original sketch of, and it was published. She lived in Goodland, Kansas, and they published it in the Goodland paper, maybe the Denver paper occasionally.
Like anti-Bob Dole stuff?
No, this is before that.
Harry Truman smack?
Probably in between Truman and Dole. It was when one of the first women to race in NASCAR or Indy 500 or something was there, and it's this kind of drawing of a race car and a bunch of race cars often, kind of lined up next to it, but they're sort of small and off in the distance. And it says, "Race persons, start your engines." And it was to go with the first woman driving in a race. Yeah.
But she was for it or against it?
She was for it. She was a big feminist. Yeah, she was just saying they can't say "gentlemen, start your engines" anymore.
Right.
Which I don't think they do anymore anyway.
Actually, when they actually did that, when that woman did run, they said, "Lady and gentlemen, start your engines," is what they actually said.
and that sounds so sort of derogatory, like "lady, hey lady," like you shout that at somebody when they're stepping on your toes or something. "Hey lady, get out of my way."
They did not say gentle persons or gentle people start your engines. They said lady and gentlemen.
They didn't say race persons either, like my grandma.
And then I think that eventually there were more than one women, right? And then they said ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. Lady would be very awkward.
Do you have that cartoon framed somewhere?
I don't have it framed, but I think I have it in an envelope. I should find that.
Should frame it.
Collector's item. He also, in addition to coming up with political cartoons in the U.S., by the way, this cartoon that he did was called "Join or Die," and it was used to encourage the colonies to join the French and Indian War. And then later it was resurrected as a symbol in support of the American Revolution. So I think you can find it online. Like Ben Franklin's
that sounds familiar.
"Join or Die." It's like the "Don't Tread on Me."
Right.
He founded the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, which was one of the first hospitals in the United States in the colonies at the time. He also created the Union Fire Company, which was one of the first volunteer fire departments. And he also was a big advocate, and this no surprise here, for paper money. So at the time, it was coins. It was all coins, but he wanted paper money, and he had this idea for ways to keep it from being counterfeited. And so he kind of got more and more people to adopt paper money.
The problem with paper money before the technology was good is it seems like if it ripped, you were in trouble.
Yeah, you couldn't really, you had to take really good care of it, and it was probably more fragile. Although, I don't know, maybe things were made better back then.
I've heard in some countries that if the part of the bill is ripped, it's only worth that fraction of that amount.
Really? That's an interesting, very, very, very literal way of doing it.
Right. So you could actually rip a bill in two and it's still worth something.
50 cents.
But if you lose half of it, it's only worth half of that.
But if you don't have exact change, you need to pay somebody. You rip it and hand them.
But here, if you cut a dollar bill in half, it's worthless.
Right.
At least in that country, wherever I'm talking about, it's still worth. It's still worth something?
You mean made up?
Do you think I'm not making this up? I'm not making this up.
We should research that. He founded the American Philosophical Society for scientific men. And he also raised a militia during King George's War to defend Philadelphia. And actually, they had a series of defenses built around Philadelphia, including a battery of 50 guns around it.
Wow.
Now, this is before the Revolution. In 1747, he retired from printing. He already made a lot of money, and he started working more in science and politics. So in 1748, he became elected as a councilman in Philadelphia. In 1749, he became the Justice of the Peace. And then he was elected to the Assembly in 1751. And then in 1753, not a lot of people, I think people might know this about him, but he became the Postmaster General of British North America. Now, this is still before America was America, but this was British North America. But he was one of the first people to be Postmaster General, and he was responsible for all kinds of innovations with the postal service, including like delivering more frequently, actually giving people badges. I think if you were a postman back then, you had a badge that would allow you safe access through people's property. All kinds of perks with being a postman back in the day. he also was key to helping found the new model of the American college with Samuel Johnson and William Smith. Basically, instead of having one teacher that taught a class for all 4 years throughout college, as had been the tradition, they started having specialists in different areas, mathematical specialists or art specialists or literature or whatever, which was a new idea. And then they also got rid of the religious test. Back in the day, you had to take a religious test to join a college. Yeah. You didn't have to take one for your college?
No, I'm at a public university.
Yeah. What about do you teach the same class, or do you teach the same kids for all 4 years?
Not every class they take. That's more like the kindergarten model, right? Where you just have one teacher all day long.
The school they founded was called the College of Philadelphia, and it eventually became the University of Pennsylvania. And its first graduating class in 1757 had a graduating class of 7 men. I think, as you know, he was honored many times on postage stamps. He's been on a lot of postage stamps, but again, really innovated with the Postal Service, giving people these badges that they could use to get from place to place, making deliveries more frequently. And he also ended up going back to London between 1757 and 1775 to be sort of an ambassador to the colonies. And at that time, he was kind of working under a lot of assumptions about things that were going on in the colonies that people didn't like. And he was trying to straddle the middle ground. So taxation was a big thing, right? A lot of the colonists felt like they were being taxed too much. And he had to sort of work both ends of the aisle in order to get things accomplished. Well, he did this for a long time. And eventually, because he had let some things slip and had even published some things that were unflattering to the royals and to the British monarchy, he fell out of favor with the monarchy and ended up having to come back to the colonies. He basically was not kicked out of England, but no longer trusted and no longer effective there.
I wonder how much the average person, average farmer in the colonies used to follow that stuff. You said that a lot of this drama played out in the newspapers, but I wonder if this is the kind of thing that people used, or if there was a certain class of people that used to follow this kind of stuff, and like Renaissance people. And if it was really like inside palace intrigue kind of stuff, or if the average person really even knew what was going on with this.
I think they probably knew more than we would give them credit for, because I feel like it really impacted their lives. I mean, first of all, having to pay these taxes, that was something that even if you lived out in the boonies, they probably came looking for you to collect the taxes. And number two, who was in power, whether it was the crown or the colonists, that would have a big impact on your life too, right?
Yeah, and in order to spark a revolution, you'd have to have people kind of
paying attention.
Just hard to put that on today's world, where most people are just kind of apathetic about everything.
I think Ben Franklin came at it from a very much an altruistic point of view, trying to be honest with people. And yeah, he was an entrepreneur. He made money. But as I said earlier, he felt like the printing press was a tool to spread morality and to guide the country. And I think he really believed that at the time. He ended up coming back in 1775 from Great Britain, and he was appointed a member of a committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. So he was involved in that. He actually had gout during that time. And remember, this was, he was born in 1906. So he was he was born in 1706. So he was almost 70 years old at this point. And so, getting up there, he struggled with gout later in life, but he ended up making edits to the Declaration of Independence that are considered very important. And he was quoted as saying, he replied to a comment that John Hancock said when they were signing it, and he said, "We must all hang together." And Franklin said, "Yes, we must indeed all hang together, or we will most assuredly all hang separately."
That's right. That's a famous one. Yeah.
Pretty good quote.
Did you ever see the HBO show John Adams?
No.
It's a good one with Paul Giamatti as John Adams.
Okay.
And it goes through that time, that revolutionary time and drafting the Constitution. And Ben Franklin's a great character in that show. And what you forget, I guess, when you think of it, you kind of think of all these founding fathers as like, a bunch of dudes around the same age. But that show really shows that like he was an old man when all this was happening. And all these other guys were like in their 20s and 30s that were the other authors of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. And he was just this elder statesman that would chime in on things, like you said, for edits and things like that. But, his vibe was, I'm kind of too old to lead this charge, but I'll help you guys with anything you want. But he was an old man. And all these other people were really young at the time.
And not only an old man, but by today's standards, he was old. By those standards, he was ancient. People didn't live as long back then, right?
Mid-70s, yeah. He's also got this iconic look to him that I don't even say if I've ever seen a picture of him with hair, like where he wasn't bald.
Yeah, you don't see pictures of him when he was younger.
Never do.
Right?
No, I can't even picture that. It's always the bifocals and the long hair in the back, but kind of bald at the top, just the kind of the classic BF look,
Yeah, classic BF. Yeah. Hashtag classic BF look. Yeah. B. Franklin Printer. Well, he ended up getting involved in not only the Declaration of Independence, but of course the Constitution. He was part of that. He was named the Postmaster General of the United States. And I feel like that's one of those jobs that today we kind of snicker at a little bit, like Postmaster General, like what is that really? But I think back then that held a lot of weight.
It probably is a pretty important job when you consider, maybe less so now because of electronic communications, but when you consider that all communication kind of had to go through that job, you could really help or hurt communication. And he was the perfect guy to do it, right? With his experience.
Yeah, he seemed to be very what you see is what you get kind of guy. He put it out there and seemed to have the country's best interest, and had always advocated for communication between the colonies. Well, as all this is going on, leading up to the revolution and stuff, he's also working on a ton of science stuff. I mentioned earlier with all his letters, the FRS and the FRSA and the FRSE, etc. He was very interested in science. He had been one of the first people to really theorize about lightning being a form of electricity. And he actually invented the lightning rod, which you don't really think of that as an invention. It just seems like something that would have always been. But if somebody hadn't come up with that, it was kind of a way that you could protect tall buildings, but also you could sort of capture or harness the power of lightning. And he had this idea to capture lightning in something called a Leyden jar. So he was going to use a lightning rod going into a Leyden jar to capture it. This didn't really work because, of course, it's static electricity and it goes very quickly and then it disappears very powerfully. But of course, what he's most famous for is what?
The key on the end of the kite.
Right. And according to the research I did, that story is based on a true story, but it's not true the way it happened. Everybody thinks that the kite was hit by lightning and he got shocked. But they say that if that had actually happened, he probably would have really been injured or even killed. And so the the more plausible story is that he touched the key and just felt the charge of the lightning, felt some electricity going through. But whatever the case was, he did coin the terms battery. He coined the term positive and negative charge, and he discovered ways to generate and store electricity. Battery, if you think about it, was a series of guns, right? And maybe he looked at it as a way, like as another word for potential energy or something. But
well, I don't know. I've seen plenty of cartoons to dispute your notion. I thought that's how he lost his hair. That the lightning hit the key.
Right. He looked very young and had lots of hair, and then all of a sudden, boom, he's an old man, old bald man. Here's some other things that Ben Franklin invented. Of course, you've heard of the Franklin stove, right?
Yeah. It's like a heating stove, right?
Yeah. He invented the swim fins.
What were they made out of? They didn't have rubber back then.
Yeah, I mean, probably made of real fins. Probably caught a shark.
We might have to fact check
that. He invented the flexible catheter. I guess before that, they only had inflexible catheters.
Jeez, okay.
Yeah, he wasn't much of a medical guy, but he did, that's pretty important invention. He invented a 3-wheel clock that was much simpler than other clocks of that day. He invented the glass harmonica. Have you heard of this thing?
Is it a musical instrument?
It is. It's a big thing that looked kind of like a piano with all these glass jars, but they were different sizes, and they would turn, and then you would use something to touch them, kind of like you spin your finger on a wine glass and it makes a tone. You could play this thing with different sized jars using, friction.
It sounds like it might be an annoying instrument to listen to.
Yeah. I like the, what's the thing from Star Trek? The theremin.
Yeah, the theremin.
He invented the bifocals, pretty famous for that.
That's a huge
right?
invention. I mean, if that's all he did in his life, he would have contributed a lot.
And then he invented the thing called the long arm, which was basically, those robot claws that you squeeze and there's a little hand on the end, a mechanical thing for getting books.
I have one of those. It's called the grabber.
The grabber, yes. Well, he invented an early wooden version of the grabber, because I'm sure yours is made of plastic.
Actually, ours is made of, metal and plastic. Metal rod with plastic. Grabber.
He invented a lot of stuff, is what I'm saying. He ended up being the ambassador to France from 1776 to 1785. And now that was during the Revolutionary War. And the importance of that was he actually had a pretty good relationship with France and convinced them to help the colonies during that time, which was a pretty big political win for him. He was the minister to Sweden, but he never visited Sweden, so not much to tell about that. When he got back from France in 1785, he was regarded as sort of the second father of the country after George Washington. And there were some funds missing from his expedition, 100,000 pounds, not pounds as in weight, but pounds as in money, of congressional funds were missing. And when he returned, he was questioned by Congress, and he said, quoting the Bible, "Muzzle not the ox that treadeth out the master's grain." And they never mentioned it again.
All right. I like that.
Now, another thing that was pretty interesting, he wasn't super religious, but a lot of religions kind of tried to claim him, including the Quakers. And the Quakers were abolitionists, and that was part of why they tried to claim him. He did own 2 slaves. I think he owned, maybe throughout his life, like 7 slaves, which is not as many as other people, but still owned slaves. But as he became older, he freed the slaves and became a very, very strong advocate of abolition. And not only abolition, but also the education of the former slaves and sort of their assimilation into popularity or into the population.
I didn't know that.
So, yeah, he definitely later, and I think that's part of why the Quakers kind of like the idea of him. He was also someone that came up with the ideas of population studies. So I guess maybe as his job as postmaster, that was something that was important. He was one of the first people to calculate that the growth of the colonies would surpass England after a certain period of time, which really worried the English, that we would grow to be bigger, which makes sense because we have more space, right?
It did happen.
He was one of the first people to note that a storm could move the opposite direction as the wind. Like he paid a lot of attention to weather.
I love how he just kind of goes in and out of science. Like he just contributes.
Yeah. But I mean, pretty big concept, right? I mean, this was something that influenced meteorology. Yeah. Everybody thought the storms only went the direction the wind was going, but he observed by observing storms and observing, kind of where they were headed and where they actually went. He also observed an Icelandic volcanic eruption in 1783 that kind of caused him to see that basically, the jet stream and all this sort of thing. He was one of the first people to observe the principle of refrigeration by cooling a thermometer using water and then wiping it down and repeatedly cooling it and getting it down to be very cold. He was one of the first people to observe the relationship between color and heat absorption. You think about that. You wear a black shirt on a hot day, it's going to be hotter than a white shirt. It's
just common knowledge now.
Yeah. People.
He did all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, he just did all of these things. He even observed how you could pour grease or oil on water and how it would change the way the water moved. He observed that while he was on a ship. And so just had all these little things. He was just a very observant guy.
Yeah, and genius probably. Now, he was probably a creative genius.
A polymath.
Yeah.
And a creative genius. He had been raised pretty religious, right? He had pious Puritan parents, PPPs. And his family was friends with Cotton Mather. So you've heard of Cotton Mather, right? He was kind of a famous historian who wrote a lot of religious things. Well, his pen name, Silence Dogood, was taken from a Cotton Mather sermon. Cotton Mather had used that name, Silence Dogood.
That's kind of a weird name.
Both of them are weird. Cotton Mather and Silence Dogood. Yeah. He ended up being not an atheist per se, but he believed that religion was more about personal morality and civic virtue. Those were sort of his things. He called it a generic religion, and that he prayed to powerful goodness. He had a quote. So in 1790, right before he died, he wrote a letter to the president of Yale University who asked his views on religion. And he said, as to Jesus of Nazareth, on my opinion, of whom you particularly desire, I think the system of morals and his religion, as he left them to us, is the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. But I apprehend it has received various corrupt changes, and I have, with the most of the present dissenters in England, some doubts as to his divinity. I see no harm, however, in its being believed, if that belief has the good consequence, as it probably has, of making his doctrines more respected and better observed. So I think he was saying he doesn't have any issue with religion if it makes people better, but he doesn't really believe it.
Yeah. Or he could have said, none your business.
Yeah, that would have been like TLDR, right?
Yeah, right.
He was also appointed in 1776 to a 3-member committee to design the seal of the United States. Now, he had a proposal that was not adopted, and his proposal was to have a scene from Exodus. Now, he wasn't a religious man, but he was going to have a scene from Exodus with Moses, the Israelites, the pillar of fire, and George III as the Pharaoh. And then it was going to say, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God.
It seems, I'm trying to picture that like on the back of a quarter. It seems like a lot.
Right. But it's pretty cool. Like you do it all up in sort of like anime style.
Yeah, but from a graphic design perspective, it's a lot. Not that simple.
He had strong beliefs in freedom of speech. As a matter of fact, he said, in those wretched countries where a man cannot call his tongue his own, he can scarce call anything his own, which I think was pretty good. And then he wrote and lived by, and he wrote this, by the way, at the age of 20 in 1726, 13 virtues. Have you heard of these 13 virtues?
Yeah, I have. I have heard of this. At 20 years old, huh?
Yeah.
Patience, one of them? So the expression patience is a virtue.
That was the one thing he wasn't. It was temperance. And I like his quote on temperance. It says, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation.
He had gout.
well, that's true.
Hypocrite. And he drank too, I think. I think he was a drinker especially when he got to France.
Oh, well, yeah, that's what they, when in France.
But he was under 21 at the time, so.
Yeah, they didn't care in France. They still don't care in France.
I mean, when he wrote that, he hadn't experienced it all yet. He hadn't had any wine yet, probably.
Yeah.
Not good wine.
Temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility.
And other than the last one that you just said, I think a lot of those are what you would find in kind of the American DNA.
Yeah.
Not humility, though. That's one that we somehow we left that by the wayside. And he is really known for that frugality. I think that's that kind of, didn't he say waste not, want not?
No, actually he was misquoted. He said something about a penny saved. A penny saved is a pence saved is 2 pence instead of a penny saved is a penny earned. It's usually misquoted as that. But yeah, it's kind of the same idea. But here's the thing, you mentioned about him having gout and about, maybe not following all of those. He actually said that he wasn't able to follow them. He considered himself to be a flawed man, and he would not work on them all at once. He actually would do one per week. So every week he would work on one of those things, one of those 13 virtues, and then he would switch the next week. And so during the week when he was working on cleanliness, he could take a shower and be clean, pick things up, but he could also drink all he wanted or eat all he wanted.
So he was only showering every 13 weeks.
Right. Yeah, he basically said he couldn't do them all at once, but he would work on one per week, and that he hoped that writing them down would be a benefit for his descendants.
That's a little obsessive, really.
Well, I mean, you had to be to be a guy back then, I think.
Interesting brain of his. Now you've never, still haven't mentioned one fable that we all know about. Maybe it's not a fable, maybe it's true. Do you know the one thing that you haven't mentioned that everybody knows about Ben Franklin?
That he was a vegetarian?
No. I don't think people know that.
He was a vegetarian, and he was an abolitionist. He was very pro inoculation, like
vaccines.
Getting vaccines, yeah.
No.
And there were anti-vaxxers back then, back in the day. Sure. He played chess.
No, do you know can't think of the one thing that most people know about Ben Franklin?
Ben Franklin. No, what
you've given us so much that he wanted the turkey to be the national bird.
Oh, yes.
And every Thanksgiving, we always make fun of Ben. He did all that great stuff. Yet every Thanksgiving, somebody's got to make a remark about how we'd be eating eagle if it was up to Ben Franklin, because he wanted to preserve the turkey as the national bird. We would never know what it tastes like to this day. Imagine in America where we don't know what turkey tastes like.
But we don't know what eagle tastes like. I'd kind of like to see what an eagle tastes. I mean, I got to think it's a power. It
maybe
probably
it's
gives you power.
Yeah, maybe it's better.
Doesn't make you sleepy. Less tryptophan.
Yeah. Who knows? A world where Subway is making you eagle sandwiches.
Yeah, I'll have an eagle on wheat, no onions. So he also played the violin, the harp, and the guitar. And as I mentioned earlier, he did invent the glass harmonica or armonica. And actually, both Mozart and Beethoven composed on the harmonica. They both composed things on it. He played chess, and he actually wrote an essay titled "The Morals of Chess" and talked about how chess was, like there was sort of a analogy of chess to life and how you played, you got stronger by playing stronger opponents. But one other interesting thing he did was he and a friend were trying to learn Italian, and they would play chess, and whoever lost had to memorize like an entire thing in Italian, like either a saying or something, and that was their way of learning by playing chess.
Nerd.
He was actually inducted into the U.S. Hall of Chess Fame, U.S. Chess Hall of Fame in 1999.
Good for him.
Yeah. I'm not thinking either of us will ever make it into the...
No, I've probably got a better chance of going to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame than that.
So he was the only person to have signed the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris, and the U.S. Constitution.
Wow.
The only person that signed all four of those. Pretty big deal. As you said, he did actually have some health problems due to gout, and he was overweight later in life. And kind of after 1787, after the U.S. Constitution was signed and ratified, he didn't really go out in public very much, and he died in 1790. He was 84 years old, and this is interesting because he actually, at the age of like 22, had written what he wanted on his epitaph, but it isn't actually what made it to his epitaph. But here's what he wrote. The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, correct and amended by the author.
That is cool. What is actually on it?
What it actually says on his grave is Benjamin and Deborah Franklin.
So, well, an old printer should know that you pay by the letter, and it's get pretty expensive.
Yes, yeah. Well, he's quite. I mean, there's so many things in there. Just to guess, how many of those things do you think you didn't know about Ben Franklin?
Oh, tons, man.
He's also, he's been since 1914 on the American $100 bill,
right? But
he was also on the half dollar from 1948 to 1963. He's appeared on the $50 bill several times. He's also on the $1,000 series savings bond. I mean, it's funny. His image is associated with money, but I wonder if that's more the printing thing, because he was a printer.
Right. Well, and it's the biggest denomination of money, because we don't have anything anymore greater than a $100 bill. So he's associated with making a lot of money.
Yeah, making the Benjamins. Even
though he was a frugal guy.
I hope we make it to Philadelphia sometime, because he is buried there at Christ Church Burial Ground, where it just says Benjamin and Deborah Franklin, not all the other cool words he wrote.
We should write the rest of that and just affix it to there. Make a sticker.
Just tape it on there.
Yeah, make a sticker that has all the rest of that stuff and just slap it on there.
Yeah, right on. He would do it. He would love it. I think he'd appreciate it. Well, thanks for sticking with me. Long episode, but a big man we had to cover. Ben Franklin, everyone.